All right, so we've established that the government's pretty big, but there's not really any consensus on what the government should do, how much it should do, et cetera, et cetera. Thankfully, we've got a nice handy dandy economic theory that is typically what everyone kind of defaults to in justifying government action. And this is called the market failure theory. So there's an assumption that, the free market is, when it's operating properly, should just kind of be left alone to do its own thing. Unfortunately, that's not always the case. So let me start by explaining, what a functioning market is supposed to look like. First of all, you're supposed to have many buyers and sellers. And everybody who produces a low percentage of the market output and therefore can't really influence the prevailing price. And the same thing with buyers. There are a lot of individual buyers and no one has any control over the price. So it fluctuates as the market turns. Perfect freedom of entry and exit from the industry. Now, what this means is that there's no sunk cost, that you've got to put in to enter, to exit. You're not going to be throwing away a lot of money. So all the firms in a competitive market are going to make normal profits in the long run, but you can jump into the market, you can jump out of the market at any point. All of the products are the same. They're homogenous, and they're perfect substitutes. So this means that, the firms are going to take the price that they get, because if every product is the same, then all the prices should roughly be the same. Perfect knowledge. So this is the idea that all of the available information is both available to consumers, but also understandable to consumers, and that they can access it at zero cost. So that means that there aren't going to be transaction costs in learning the information about prices or whether you're being priced fairly. And the sellers are also going to have knowledge of their competitors. That the factors of production are supposed to be perfectly mobile. So the land, the labor, the capital can all be interchanged really quickly as a result of changing market conditions. The idea is that there's no externalities or positive or negative effects that arise from the production or consumption of a good. So that's what it's supposed to look like, but that's not really what happens. So yes, there are barriers to entry in some markets, and in some cases that leads to what we call a monopoly, where there's only, one provider of a good or service, or a monopsony, where there's only one purchaser of a good or service, especially for very niche products. Information asymmetries abound, not only in the fact that often the sellers of stuff aren't going to be completely transparent and forthcoming, but also because there's different levels of knowledge among buyers and different levels of access and information literacy, the ability to understand what it is that they're reading and doing their research on a product. Immobile factors of production. You can't just pick up and move a factory somewhere. I mean, the fact of the matter is that, large investments are going to be somewhat immobile. There's also when you think about the human capital involved and the people, if you've got, a region that, such as Michigan and the upper Midwest, that has very specialized history and, tends to have people with a lot of specialized skills, such as in the auto industry, it's may not be as simple to just pick all those people up and move them or find other qualified people to work in the auto industry in other locations. Externalities. Obviously, negative externalities are the ones we think of the most. Pollution. Gosh, that's a big one. You can think about, all the industry in Kalamazoo that developed, especially, from the 40s and onward into the 70s. Actually, working with a capstone class in the spring semester, they did their project on the Kalamazoo River, and we found a map from 1967 of Kalamazoo, and you can see where there are like kids' playgrounds right across from the sewage pits. I mean, industry dumped a lot of pollution into the river. And that's a negative externality of industry because the production and consumption of the paper and all the various other chemicals and things that have been manufactured around here, they have a negative effect on the environment. Then you also have the free rider problem. And this is where there's a shared resource and, like a lake or, air or water or something like that. And you, you know, you can't really control use to it. It's, obviously a public good. It's non-excludable and it's non-rivalrous. So no one's going to, everyone gets to benefit from it. In a free rider problem, someone's taking more than their fair share. Um, and, or, people are, everyone pays for it, support for something on, based on their tax money, but some people aren't paying in and still take more, more than others. That's a free rider problem. Public goods usually mean that there needs to be some government intervention to manage that. So when you think about, lakes and streams and waterways and stuff like that, but also, the air, air pollution. Air is something that is not rivalrous and non-excludable. Otherwise, somebody would be bottling and selling it, although some people do. That's a whole different thing. Um, so yeah, your lakes and streams and stuff, that's why we have the Department of Natural Resources. And then there's the issue of the tragedy of the commons, um, where you've got some sort of shared resource system. And um, individual users end up acting according to their own self-interest instead of the broader the good of the public. So this might be where you're overfishing a lake or something like that, where you use more because you want to, but not because it's not necessarily good for the everybody. Overhunting, overfishing, extinction level events, these are kind of common. So that's the primary justification for any sort of government action. Usually there's a market failure that you're trying to correct, or there's a public good that you're trying to safeguard. That's the government side. Now let's get into the nonprofit side of things. There are a handful of different theories that explain why the nonprofit sector exists and what its value is to society. The first is the sociological perspective. And this is saying that, being involved in nonprofits and stuff like that helps in socializing individuals. It also provides reinforcement of social norms and values through various institutions. And then it also helps build social capital, reinforcing that trust and cooperation that you've got with other people in your community. There's a political science perspective to this, and this is where nonprofits help accommodate the diversity in values and beliefs that government just can't quite handle. It also allows for, social programs to work in like experimental incubator fashion to see if they can work and maybe be replicated in other places. It also means that, organizations can quickly respond to the needs of a community because they're free from those bureaucratic constraints, like I was talking about in the conservative perspective of why nonprofits are good. And then also because they can consider the needs and the voices of minority groups who might otherwise have limited influence in political circles. Again, economics, yes, there is both a supply and a demand side. From the supply side, there's a theory of entrepreneurship, the idea that individuals who have, strong values or bold ideas decide to take action. But more likely, we look at the demand side. Obviously, market failures, externalities, those unintended consequences, and the free rider problem, the information asymmetries. Governments usually will step in, but not all the time. So nonprofits frequently try to fill the gaps. And, I'll get back to this a little bit because there are some cases where, government might act or, markets may be efficient, and we come back to that. But the altruism perspective is also important here. It's this idea that, wealthy altruism, really just doing good to do good because it be good for goodness sake. Is that really what's happening? Or is this some sort of, social control? Look at all the good things that my money's doing, so buy more stuff from my company. Um, Research suggests that it's really a combination, that there is some altruism, but it's also self-regarding. And so there's, some controversial bits that we who study giving and philanthropy look at, and we call it the new physics of philanthropy. This idea that, first, hyper agency, having this enhanced control over your environment and what's going on in your world. Um, Identification, empathy with others is one reason that some people may give. Association. So, having some sort of activity that, well, I'm wealthy, but I'm going to feel connected to people in need somehow. Death and the desire to leave a legacy, to have a name live on after you. Gratitude and giving back to society. And then there's tax aversion. Charitable giving is usually tax deductible. And especially with some modern changes to the tax code, there are certain things like, donor advised funds and other things that work more as a tax dodge, but don't even necessarily immediately put money into the hands of charitable organizations. So there's a lot of worry and concern over how, especially big giving is going to um, move in the future. But we'll worry about that another time when we talk about revenue generation and a bit more about how nonprofits get their money. So that brings me back to this idea of public value failure. The title of the paper that first introduced it was called Public Value Failure: When Efficient Markets Will Not Do. And so here on the PowerPoint, I've got a list, and obviously I don't need to read them off to you, but there's also a separate document in e-learning that I want you to take a look at because it gives a little more explanation and gives examples of when some of these market failures might, or, when markets may be acting efficiently, but still that's not good enough. Still, there is a social problem. And so the argument here is that when you see some of these public value failures, there is a rationale for government to get involved, or sometimes the nonprofit sector. Things like scarcity of providers. If we talk about limited numbers of teachers or healthcare workers, especially in the post-pandemic landscape. If there aren't enough people to provide certain services, maybe the government steps in and provides incentives for that, or nonprofit organizations step in and provide incentives for that. And so we've actually seen government response in some way in terms of promoting public service, because there was for a while a shortage of people willing to go work in the public sector. And so we have public service loan forgiveness for people who are willing to go spend 10 years as a teacher or, working for a government agency. A short time horizon where you're only thinking 2, 3, 5 years out, but you're not thinking about those long-term externalities. What happens if I pollute this river to the wildlife 50 years from now? When you're not thinking long-term and focusing short-term, you make different decisions. And sometimes those decisions can have those long-term unintended consequences. Again, the market may be functioning efficiently, but this could be a good time for you know, for government intervention. Threats to subsistence and human dignity. When we think about issues like the homelessness crisis that we see nationally, not just in Kalamazoo, when you think about things like modern day slavery, it does exist. It exists here in the United States. Those are threats to human dignity. And yeah, markets for slaves, they do exist and they do function pretty efficiently. But I think we can all agree that that is a public value failure, that they still exist, and that is a good rationale for, human trafficking is a great rationale for government to get involved to try and stop something. So anyway, that's just a brief overview of the theories of the, both the public and the nonprofit sector and why they exist. Next week, we'll start digging a little deeper. So hopefully this introduction wasn't too big, bad, or scary for any of you. Really looking forward to seeing what you've got to say in your discussion post, both for, the module discussion for this first week, as well as in your current news articles and seeing what you found. Say hello on the introduction board, and I will see you guys next week.